It's often difficult to know what to do with the marks of a learner who doesn't complete a school-based assessment or exam. So for formal assessment tasks that need to be put towards the progression and promotion of the learner, what do we do? Now, the policy gives us quite clear guidelines. There are two different scenarios. The first is in a school-based assessment, which is a non-exam situation, and the other is an exam situation. Now, let's look at the learner absent for a school-based assessment first. There are two possibilities here. Either the learner has a legitimate reason or they don't. Now let's have a look and see what is considered as a legitimate or valid reason. The policy give a couple of suggestions. The first is illness, when a learner genuinely is ill and is not able to come to school for whatever reason. And there the learner needs a medical certificate. The second is circumstances beyond the learner's control. So in a situation where maybe it's not an illness, but it might be a death in the family, it could be a number of things. But there the learner needs to bring an affidavit to say that that situation really did take place. With any of these scenarios, the learner needs to be given another opportunity to complete the task. So where the learner comes and completes the task, that learner receives the mark that they got for that task. So there's no change in marks. It's not marked out of a different amount. The learner receives that mark. Where you have a situation where the learner doesn't complete the task. So for example, you might have the learner's absent for the entire term, in which case there isn't another opportunity. In a case like that, the learner's mark or term mark is reworked out of a lower total. So that particular task of the whole entire school-based assessment mark for the end of the term is excluded from the total mark. Now, what happens when there isn't a valid or legitimate reason? Well, once again, the learner is given another opportunity, and the policy is very clear with this. We need to give the learner another opportunity, and I know this is frustrating for a lot of teachers. But then you've got two scenarios here as well. Either the learner completes it or they don't. So, for example, you might have given a project and the learner doesn't have a legitimate reason as to why they didn't hand it in, and you say to the learner, right, I'm giving you another chance to hand it in. If the learner then does hand it in, the learner receives the mark that they get. But more importantly, if the learner, after being given a second chance, doesn't hand it in, that learner receives naught. And I think what's important for us to see here is you can't mark the learner's mark out of a lower mark, take out marks off marks for late work and so on. They have to receive that mark. And I think this is where the difference between formal and informal assessment also comes in. In informal assessment, we need to teach the learners that you've got to take responsibility to hand things in on time, and you've got to take responsibility to actually be at school when there's a test and so on, because for formal assessment we're not allowed to take off marks. Let's have a look at the learner's absent for an exam. Now once again, you've got valid and invalid reasons. And their valid reasons are exactly the same as they were for the assessment based. So let's say you've got a learner who is genuinely ill and misses an exam. You need to make sure you've got acceptable proof. So if you've got acceptable proof, there's a different path you follow for not having acceptable proof. So there might be a legitimate illness, but you haven't received a medical certificate. So let's say you've got a legitimate illness and the learner sent a medical certificate. The learner is then exempted from the exam. And then the learner receives a mark which is based on their school-based assessment. That's if they bring a valid and acceptable proof that they were actually ill or their circumstances beyond their control. What happens if you don't get that medical certificate? Well, then the learner receives naught. And this is very clear in the policy. What happens if the learner didn't have a valid or legitimate reason? Well, again, the learner receives naught. So you can see for an exam, it's a lot more strict. The learner doesn't get another chance to write an exam. They either have a legitimate reason and they provide proof, in which case they get a school-based assessment mark. In the case that they might have been ill but there's no proof or there's no legitimate reason, the learner receives naught. And what is essential for us as teachers and from the school's point of view is to communicate this to the learners and even more importantly to the parents. So make sure your assessment policies have this clearly written, that the learners know what's going to happen if they miss an exam or a school-based assessment, and so do the parents.